Welcome everyone to another webinar organized by EU DisinfoLab as part of our weekly webinar series. Before we begin, a quick but important reminder. We are already working on the EU DisinfoLab annual conference happening in Ljubljana in October 2025. I know it may seem far off, but time flies. And if you have a publication, investigation, or any idea for a talk on this information, we would love to hear from you. So you can submit your proposal. You'll find the form on our website, and hurry because the deadline is tomorrow. Now back to today's event. As always, we are thrilled to see such a great turnout. Today we have over 125 participants registered. As a matter of fact, our webinars have been incredibly successful, and that's something that we are truly proud of. And we have to thank you for being there. So we really appreciate your time and engagement. Before we dive into today's session, I have a few housekeeping notes to share. We will be using Slido as our interactive platform, so we encourage you to connect already. You can join by scanning the QR code that is displayed on your screen, or you can also go to slido.com and enter the password #disinfo. Is it here in Slido where you have to submit any question to our guest speaker? So just to let you know that the Zoom chat will not be used for Q&A. Slido is already open, so feel free to start submitting your questions at any time. You don't have to wait until the end of the presentation. Also, another quick reminder, this webinar is being recorded. If you would like to rewatch it or to share it later, it will be soon available on our YouTube channel and also on our website. Once again, good afternoon. My name is Ana Romero. I am a counter disinformation expert at EU DisinfoLab, and I'm honored to moderate today's session, Clearing the Air, Building Trust Against Climate Misinformation Storms. Before we get started, we would love to know more about you. So through Slido, please take a moment to tell us where are you joining us from today. Let's wait for some answers. Brussels, hello, bonjour. Madrid, hey, hola. Vilnius, Wales, Cardiff, London, Poland, Toulouse. Thank you very much. May I ask you in which sector do you work? Okay, many people from non-government organization, good percentage of academia, media. Again, thank you very much for being here today. I'm sure that many people will keep joining. We all know that climate change is an undeniable reality, yet despite the overwhelming evidence, efforts to distort the facts persist. And we've seen the devastating consequences unfold around the world. Just recently, Spain suffered catastrophic flooding, resulting in 224 deaths and widespread destruction. France also faced its worst floods in 40 years, leaving entire communities in complete chaos. In the US, Hurricane Helene struck the East Coast, claiming 230 lives. Meanwhile, wildfires in Los Angeles scorched nearly 4,000 acres and led to 27 fatalities. Devastating events, heartbreaking numbers. And I bring them up because we must not forget that climate disasters are no longer distant tragedies. They are a present reality. And despite that, disinformation surge, casting doubts, shifting blame, and distorting public understanding of climate change. Some narratives claimed that extreme weather is the result of weather manipulation or failing infrastructures, while others attribute it to divine will, or they just simply insist that these are part of natural cycles. These narratives don't just confuse the public, they actively undermine climate action and add another layer of risk of an already urgent crisis. That's why we are here today. We will explore how climate myths and disinformation not only skews public perception, but also how intersects with broader online harms, hate speech, harassment, health disinformation, and even incitement to violence. We will also discuss the policy implications, particularly in the context of the Digital Service Act. To help us make sense of it all, I'm honored to introduce Jodie Molyneux, subject matter expert in misinformation at Resolver, Kroll business. Jodie, thank you for joining us today. She has extensive experience in tackling complex misinformation issues, from medical disinformation to conspiracy theories, political narratives, and brand reputation risks. She works closely with global social media companies and intelligence teams to deliver precise and timely insights. Without further ado, Jodie, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I will share my screen. Nice to meet everybody. Good afternoon. This is Clearing the Air. That was a fantastic introduction. I will go a touch further and introduce myself a little bit more. My name's Jodie. I've worked with Resolver Trust and Safety for over 5 years. Resolver Trust and Safety is in its 20th year now. We originally started to protect child safety, tackle child endangerment on the internet. Over time, we've expanded our intelligence offering to now include teams looking at graphic violence risks, hate speech, harassment, harmful and dangerous activity, risks associated with suicide, self-harm, violent extremism, adult risks, and of course, misdis. I came to Resolver with a journalism background, which I think gives me a unique insight into both worlds of newsrooms and intelligence. I've seen firsthand how newsrooms are full of people deeply committed to their work and doing their best for their readers. And now with Resolver, I see the same dedication in the teams we work with at platforms, governments, and regulators. At Resolver, my team and I conduct investigations and issue intelligence reporting on, as Anna introduced, medical, political, and scientific misdis, but also FIMI, or information operations, looking at activities from hostile states for other clients. As a self-confessed millennial, I've grown up with the internet. I feel lucky that with this job, I can satisfy my curiosity in the weird and wonderful parts of the internet, but also help to influence policies, working with platforms to tackle the more harmful and damaging sides. So the agenda, I'm aware I'm in a room full of experts, so the definition introduction of climate misdis I will gloss over. Just a quick brief discussion of its limitations. I will use Hurricane Helene and Milton and the LA wildfires as case studies to review how mis and disinformation comes from straight mis and disinformation and again transfers over into other risk areas. We'll have a look at where this leaves us in terms of policy and then a brief look forward. So throughout this presentation, you'll hear me refer to the topic as misdis. This is verbal shorthand for misinformation, disinformation, but please don't take that to imply that they mean the same thing. Climate misinformation refers to the spread of inaccurate information about climate change that can arise from human error. This can come from a genuine misunderstanding of information or a misinterpretation of data. Disinformation, on the other hand, is driven by a deliberate intent to spread knowingly false information, perhaps to protect one's own interests for financial gain. What does this look like? I found American climatologist Michael Mann's 6 Stages of Denial a good way of laying out the key narratives. On the left, we have the most old school, arguably a bit retro narrative of denial. Global warming does not exist, CO2 is not increasing, ice isn't melting, and so on. This narrative is fading out, however, as climate skeptic researcher John Cook puts it, science denial has simply become untenable. The science is just too stark to ignore. Deflection may appear as global warming is actually just part of a natural global cycle. This could come from oil companies themselves urging individuals to take personal responsibility over systemic solutions that would actually have the greatest impact. For example, the initiative of a climate footprint. Delay, this could look like plants and animals are benefiting from climate impacts. Human impact is small. Division, this is where infighting is created within the movement to slow it down, essentially. There's racial division, there's division within, veganist movements, or, do you air travel? You shouldn't, people turning against each other, or even turning on researchers, accusing them of being unreliable. Despair, possibly one we can all empathize with. We've been doing this for years already with no improvement. Solar panels and wind farms, they damage the environment too, as it'll lose-lose. And then doomism, the idea that it's too late, demise is imminent. This sells headlines and gets attention, but it doesn't mobilize people. Why take action when there's no point? So with Misdis, there are topics that are clear-cut. They're unequivocally false and low risk, such as the ones displayed here. Elvis is alive and well, birds aren't real. But there are others that live in more of a grey area where the research is still ongoing. As we all know in this webinar, questioning is part of a healthy discourse, and there have been many unlikely events in the past that turned out to be true. This quote taken from a UK government roundtable on the impact of climate change Misdis outlines the danger in disregarding those that question the status quo. Of course, on some topics, we don't have all of the answers. It's also important to highlight that much of the research on climate change Misdis predominantly features Western voices. My research into this topic surfaced significant risk in the US and the UK. This could be the frequency illusion, as I primarily work in English, but it could also be that activists and researchers target Western countries. These nations' wealth building activity is one of the biggest contributors to climate change. So it does make sense to direct calls to action to the worst offenders. However, it is the global south that will and already does experience the most severe impacts. So let's have a reminder of Hurricane Helene before we go into the mis and disinformation. In September of last year, a deadly tropical cyclone named Helene intensified rapidly, becoming Category 4 in a matter of days. She made landfall in Florida, where winds of 140 miles an hour were recorded, triggering catastrophic rainfall, triggered flooding in North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. And it also generated numerous tornadoes. As of January this year, it resulted in 219 deaths and caused 78.7 billion in damages. In a scientific assessment, researchers found that Helene had 10% more rain, winds that were 13 miles an hour more intense, and drew energy from water that was 2.3 degrees Fahrenheit warmer due to climate change. Climate change increased the destruction from the hurricane by more than double. We'll continue with some further context before we dive into the narratives. Those living in the Southwest had less than 2 weeks to catch their breath before the arrival of Hurricane Milton, which is the second most intense hurricane ever recorded over the Gulf of Mexico, or America, the Gulf of America, and the strongest tropical cyclone to occur worldwide in 2024. Within 2 days of forming, Milton underwent an explosive intensification and became Category 5 with winds of 180 miles an hour. Milton killed at least 35 people across the US and Mexico and resulted in 34.3 billion in damages. According to scientists, the abnormally high sea surface temperature, which enabled the fast intensification, was made 400 to 800 times more probable due to climate change. Using statistical modeling, the scientists hypothesized that without climate change, Milton would have made landfall as a Category 2 instead of a Category 3 storm. As Anna mentioned before, natural disasters spawn conspiracy theories which spread rapidly. We all know this. Some of the most obvious, most frequent ones were weather modification, which is the act of intentionally altering the weather. Cloud seeding is the most common form of modification and involves attempting to change the amount or precipitation that falls. Weather modification has been used in the past in military warfare, for example, in the Vietnam War. However, this was definitively not used in the hurricanes. Many of the theories relate to real and alleged weather controlling projects, particularly following these adverse weather events. Theorists suggested that the Radio Technology Research Program, funded by the US government, HAARP, played a part in Hurricanes Helene and Milton, along with Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and past earthquakes across the world. It suggested that these hurricanes were created to be used as a weapon for a multitude of reasons. To disable and prevent political groups from voting as a form of government control, in order to take control of the land for property development or to make use of its natural resources. One narrative spread on mainstream social media claiming authorities had geoengineered the hurricanes to affect the East Coast in an attempt to commandeer lithium mines. The local government in Chimney Rock in North Carolina was forced to confirm that there were no wider government plans to seize the town to build a lithium mine, and despite allegations, there was no town meeting in which it was decided that the town would be demolished. So we see the kind of straight up mistis, as we expect, kind of becomes compounded over time and spreads into other risk verticals such as hate speech, harmful and dangerous, and harassment. When US Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas warned in October that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, may not have funds to last throughout the hurricane season, people looked for someone to blame. Allegations began to spread, largely originating from right-wing media outlets, that FEMA had previously spent $59 million on helping migrants to settle in the US, while victims of the hurricane would only be eligible to receive $750. Despite an official statement from FEMA outlining the fact that there were funds available and that $750 is only the initial amount given to victims, sentiment became increasingly hostile towards migrants, the agency, and Mayorkas himself. Racist and anti-migrant hate speech spiked on social media. On 4chan, it included slurs, claims that migrants entering America were criminals, the promotion of white supremacy, and incitement to violence. Anti-Semitic hate speech and harassment were also directed at politicians, with users pointing out how many FEMA agents were Jewish or had traditional Jewish surnames. These narratives are seeing a revival as the US Department for Government Efficiency, or DOGE, reviews FEMA. Just last week, on the 11th of February, the department fired the agents in charge of finances in FEMA for housing migrants in what Musk called luxury hotels in New York. In my own research, I noticed significant volumes of anti-Semitism on mainstream social media, drawing parallels between those believed to be Jewish and their role in allegedly controlling money. Meteorologists also faced online harassment. Scientist and hurricane specialist John Morales faced abuse when he became emotional when reporting on Hurricane Milton, using the natural disaster as a chance to call attention to climate change. Many meteorologists reported abuse and death threats on social media, accusing them of participating in the creation of the hurricanes they were warning about. Finally, in the wake of Helene and Milton, federal agencies were forced to issue warnings about a wave of opportunistic scams and price gouging schemes targeting victims. Scams included services offering to help victims qualify for FEMA funds. However, when urging residents on social media to be vigilant to such scams, FEMA actually received high levels of abuse and accusations that they were not helping victims. So, as we've seen, hate and harassment spiraled from mis and dis narratives following the hurricanes, but how did it cross into incitement to violence? Social media users who felt shortchanged by FEMA's financial aid, felt secondary to incoming migrants, threatened the agency workers online. They called for their arrest, the destruction of the agency, and ultimately the execution of its workers. One user on a fringe platform called for Mayorkas himself to be arrested and hung for allegedly committing treason. Sadly, these risks were not confined to the online world. In North Carolina, as one of the worst hit states, misinformation about FEMA spread, that relief workers were not providing victims with aid, they were taking up valuable rooms in nearby hotels, and that they were antagonizing and intimidating victims. White supremacist group Patriot Front attempted to launch their own relief efforts in North Carolina and Florida, co-opting the disaster in order to spread their message and promote their public profile. The pressure cooker of Mistis reached its boiling point when a man was arrested armed with a handgun and rifle outside of a storm relief site, having posted threats towards FEMA employees online. The man was charged with a misdemeanor, and while the situation could clearly have been a lot worse, it still had an impact on relief efforts in that state. Following reports made to the National Guard, an armed militia hunting FEMA workers, following those reports, relief efforts were paused and temporarily relocated over safety concerns. Victims of the hurricane abused and threatened relief workers, refused their help at storm relief sites, while other users alleged that the armed militia claim was fabricated by FEMA to cover up a failed rescue mission of the area. At Resolver Trust and Safety, we have a really interesting viewpoint of working across teams, cross-vertical, and we often have a really unique standpoint of seeing how it starts in one team and it slowly starts to affect many other teams, crossing over into all different risk verticals. We'll go back to another case study to review how this happened for the LA wildfires. In January this year, 7 destructive wildfires tore through LA and San Diego. While it remains unknown as to what sparked these fires, a perfect set of conditions meant they eventually became some of the most destructive in California's history. They were exacerbated by drought conditions, low humidity, a buildup of tinder-dry vegetation, and hurricane-force Santa Ana winds. These winds, known for fanning wildfires and blowing embers, reached speeds of up to 100 miles an hour. As of 31st of January, the wildfires killed 29 people, destroyed more than 18,000 homes and structures, and burned over 57 acres of land in total. Once again, researchers concluded that the perfect set of conditions were made 35% more likely and 6% more intense due to climate change. A study by the World Weather Attribution suggested that human-caused climate change is helping to delay the end of the drought season, thereby promoting an overlap with the Santa Ana wind season. Yet again, we see misinformation narratives, and you may recognize some of these narratives from the hurricane season. They tend to crop up time and time again. Conspiracy theorists suggested that the fires had been purposefully started by the government as part of a land grab scheme. By raising some of the most affluent neighborhoods in LA, the government would be free to continue their development of a high-speed rail system. This is something I can't relate to. If my government wanted to implement a high-speed rail system, I think a lot of the UK would be very grateful. However, for the dubious in America, this marks the dawn of smart cities. This is an initiative to improve the lives of residents with technology and sustainability. But they fear this will bring increased levels of surveillance and tracking of residents via digital IDs. One poster called it a smart city digital ID concentration camp that would mean the government could turn you off at any time. Some users suggested that the upcoming 2028 Olympics in LA motivated the government to weaponize wildfires in order to rebuild the city as smart cities. A clip went particularly viral during this. It was a clip of Governor Josh Green following the fires in Maui, and it was edited to make him appear as though he was talking about smart cities while the fires were still ongoing. This was used as evidence for this theory. Claims of weather modification were also noted. Claims of direct energy weapons, DEW, or microwave technology with videos of alleged proof. Titles such as "The metal in the wooden post is burnt, but not the wood itself," "Melted cars, but not the tree next to it." It was very reminiscent of the 9/11 denial movement. There were also suggestions from high-profile conspiracy theorists like Naomi Wolf that Area 51 was involved in toxic accelerants being sprayed in chemtrails and via a fake fog. Once again, these narratives spiraled into other risk areas. In January, when the fires were already well established and causing great destruction, the LA Fire Department, LAFD, arrested 22 arson suspects. The majority of these cases were people experiencing homelessness or mental illness, as reported by the LA Times, and were found not to have been linked to the wildfires themselves. Nevertheless, migrants and so-called illegals were blamed for these attacks within conspiracy theorist communities. Posts on fringe platforms referred to the culprits of the arson attacks as border invaders, who were paid to commit arson and called for their murder. Similarly, sentiment became increasingly hostile towards LA's homeless, calling for deportation and the establishment of encampments. The same allegations circled about FEMA spending aid owed to victims housing migrants in luxury New York hotels. In reality, money spent on providing shelter to migrants comes from a completely separate fund to any that goes towards recovery efforts. Nevertheless, this led to government actions now trying to reclaim 80 million spent by FEMA on sheltering migrants in city hotels. Anti-Black racism saw a spike amidst allegations of looting, and posts on mainstream social media featured slurs and incitement to violence towards the alleged looters. Ex-owner Elon Musk was among those on social media suggesting that the LAFD's focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives were to blame for the department's poor preparedness for the fires. Users targeted non-white or female officials such as LAFD's fire chief Kristen Crowley and LA Mayor Karen Bass. Both women, along with other female officials within the LAFD, were faced with online harassment as well as misogynistic, homophobic, and racist hate. False claims that Crowley had reallocated $57.6 million from the Equipment and Infrastructure Fund in order to promote DEI initiatives were copied and pasted multiple times on platforms, suggesting that she was going to set up gay choirs, trans cafes, and social justice art. Now, if you are a member of communities that believe the wildfires were geoengineered and accelerant was being spread across the city via chemtrails, you too would be looking at ways to reduce the damage of this alleged exposure. This presented an opportunity for wellness influencers to promote a variety of supplements, often untested, for the purpose of detoxing and cleansing. It should be said in general, bodily organs do not need to be detoxed or supported with supplements. The Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, is not required to grant approval to any botanical or herbal products before they are sold to consumers, and therefore manufacturers aren't required to label the potency or efficacy of their products. While the FDA has the power to regulate supplements, there's so many on the market, it's difficult to cover them all. Some of the advice featured common sense, low-risk strategies that were recommended by health authorities: the use of air purifiers at home, saline nasal spray, wearing high-quality masks outdoors. But many of the wellness influencers on Instagram were recommending supplements they had a vested or financial interest in promoting, offering discount codes for supplements. Some of them included NAC powder. This is claimed that it can treat chronic lung conditions, improve kidney, liver, and brain function. However, it's only scientifically proven to help in cases of paracetamol overdose. Multi-level marketing scheme company doTERRA products were promoted on Instagram, things like essential oils in order to support the lungs following the fires. The Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, had previously brought lawsuits against doTERRA distributors for having made claims that their supplements could treat, prevent, or cure COVID-19 during the pandemic. Also recommended was raw milk, which actually can contain disease-causing microorganisms, pathogens like E. coli and Salmonella, and there is no science to suggest that drinking unpasteurized milk preserves the nutrients. Zeocharge, this is a supplement containing the mineral zeolite, which is used as a drying agent in detergents. It's claimed online that this can be used to treat cancer, autism, herpes, and in the case of the wildfires, heavy metals in the body. However, there is little published human data to support these uses, and the FDA has previously issued warning letters to distributors for making misleading claims. Many of these supplements may not be explicitly harmful, but because the products are unregulated, there is a lot of guesswork at play. Some supplements may impact other medications the user is taking, while others may pose a risk if users eschew traditional treatment in favor of these therapies. What we can see here is a blatant attempt to use the mis and disinformation and fear-mongering to profiteer from the disaster. So we've reviewed the landscape. We've looked at how misdis can spiral and cross into other risk verticals that have real-world implications. How does policy match up? Can it protect users? Can it protect free speech? There are two pieces of legislation that aim to answer these questions, one European and one UK specific. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll focus on the Digital Services Act, or the DSA. Now, I know many of us in the webinar are very well versed in the DSA, so I'll briefly just introduce it. It was introduced in 2023. It came into effect in 2023, sorry. And it aims largely to address illegal content, transparent advertising, and disinformation on social networks. The Code of Practice on Disinformation, which is going through conversion to be a code of conduct within the DSA, commits to cutting financial incentives of disinformation, transparency of political advertising, reducing manipulative behavior used to spread disinformation, empowers users to recognize and flag disinformation, empowers researchers and the fact-checking community, and also creates a rapid response system for times of crises. Within that code, it defines definition as the quote on the screen, which, as you can see, mentions the environment. How does the mis and disinformation we've covered today fare under these new rules? Firstly, not all of the platforms we've discussed are covered by the DSA, as VLOPs or VLOP, which stands for Very Large Online Platforms. They're defined as having 45 million monthly users in the EU, regardless of where they're based. What remains are the small but risky services that users flock to avoid moderation experienced on the more mainstream platforms. They are perhaps not well represented in this policy space, but other regulatory areas are starting to ask this question: where do they fit? Much of the conspiracy theories mentioned earlier do quantify as disinformation under the code. Many current platform guidelines need the disinformation to be explicit denial in order to be violative, but the code actually includes things like false information about the effectiveness of policies, efforts to create doubt about scientific consensus, and information that downplays the severity of climate change. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that the VLOPs are now required to remove this content. Instead, they must conduct risk assessments, implement measures to counter the spread, ensure transparency and moderation, and provide users with mechanisms to flag this content. Platforms do already do this, but they differ platform by platform, and the DSA content as content that promotes hatred or discrimination based on race, ethnicity, or nationality. There are barriers to strong enforcement. There are limited resources and staff, a lack of expertise in the area, coordination amongst authorities, all essential but takes time to set up. It can also be difficult to define intent. The DSA, as it says on the screen, defines it as disinformation, which implies it's shared willingly, knowingly false information. Could these users posting conspiracy theories just be confused, misinformed? Is it misinformation rather than disinformation? Is the answer moderating by behavior rather than content? Working with engineers to develop algorithms that can monitor patterns of behavior, such as spamming or indicators of coordinated inauthenticity, and user history to identify repeat or first offenders. This approach, while complex to establish, is likely more scalable than a by content approach and allows for gray areas. Some platforms are beginning to allow for customer reform, allowing users who have violated platform guidelines the chance to remove the content and keep their account rather than have their account removed and blocked immediately. So forward look, where do we go from here? We wait for results from the legislation. Both policies mention the DSA and OSA both require introduction of media literacy. The OSA mandates Ofcom to develop a media literacy strategy to help public critically evaluate content online. And the DSA requires platforms to provide users with the tools and information to understand online risk. Obviously, the political landscape in the US has experienced a dramatic shift in recent months, and this has no doubt resulted in the further polarization of views. It's likely that people are less and less exposed to differing opinions, and this can lead to echo chambers where misdis can thrive. Whether driven by political, moral, or business calculations, the new reality is moderation actions are likely to decrease in relative terms on some of the world's largest and most consequential platforms and technology services. This is a watershed moment, publicly accepting that a change in approach may lead to more harm, exposing specific communities, and declaring this as a necessary trade-off. Regardless of changes in focus and approach, Resolver believes in a meaningful, proactive effort to keep internet users and platforms safe from harm, while also protecting their right to free expression and privacy. Industry experts, researchers, activists, intelligence analysts, we can only continue in our mission to report and flag risks as we see them, to platforms we work with, to charities, to organizations, and also to our friends and family. And that is the end. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Jodie. First of all, sorry, we had some technical problems, but we were back within 40 seconds, so I hope everything was solved and people is back in the room. Thank you, Jodie. A very useful presentation. It is absolutely essential to understand the impact of climate disinformation. Identifying and naming them certainly helps in tackling so many issues. Now, let's keep the conversation going and share even more of your knowledge with the community. We are currently over 70 people in the room, which is fantastic, and I am excited to open the Q&A session. Remember to use Slido. You have the Q&A code there, or you just have to scan it, or you can go to slido.com and enter with the hashtag disinfo, and then you can submit your questions. We have over 15 minutes, no, 18 minutes for this session, so let's make the most of it. Jodie, first question from Pablo Krivenko. How effective are current fact-checking and moderation efforts in combining, I missed completely the question. Moderation effort in combating climate misinformation on major social media platforms.
Well, currently speaking, probably not very effective. A lot of the current platforms have only outright definitive denial as a violation. And as I discussed at the start, that viewpoint is really not the most popular anymore. It's more about reducing confidence in the scientific consensus of the planet is warming and we need to do something about it. Even for those who disagree with climate change the most vehemently, it's hard to say that it's not happening at all. And as such, like this, the science is becoming untenable. It's just too hard to deny outright. So I think it needs to be updated, like in the code of practice of disinformation for the DSA, to include more of the shades of climate change mistis. But obviously, this is the freedom of expression and freedom of speech is still something that platforms have to consider. So it's a real balance.
And a follow-up question is: how do you think the absence of external fact-checking on Meta's platform will impact the spread of climate misinformation and disinformation?
Yeah, there's going to be turbulence within the trust and safety sector because, as I said, the moderation is going down. And this is kind of a crucial moment for us all. I think, it's difficult to say. It certainly doesn't feel like it's going to be a good thing for climate mistis. And it does feel that climate change mis and disinformation is not really prioritized by many people, by many kind of policies and legislations and things like that. So that is the first battle, to have it taken seriously, I find, in amongst all of the risk. So yeah, not fantastic.
Fantastic. We will monitor it. Can you share your experience of which climate disinformation are more popular? Also, can you suggest some data sources for getting dataset climate misdis?
So the climate misdis that I'm seeing in my research, even for this presentation, that was the most popular, I think, is that climate researchers are corrupt. A lot of kind of infighting within, that the researchers have a financial vested interest in, this idea that the government will benefit if we all follow climate harm reduction. This kind of second guessing of the government's actions all the time was the thing I found the most common. In terms of data sources, I'm not sure, but the code of conduct for disinformation, as part of the DSA, transparency is really a key part of that. And they are publishing reports online. You can find, if you search like code of conduct for disinformation with the DSA, there are many graphs monitoring which platforms are struggling the most with disinformation. So that's a good method of reviewing some data.
Thank you. Let's go to the next question. You mentioned that climate disinfo impacts are anti-migrant or anti-Semitic sentiments. Are these also evolving into disinformation, or do they remain purely as hate?
This is a difficult one because the overlap is huge because the hate speech that the conspiracy theory that Jewish people control the world's money is disinformation, but also hateful. So it really does overlap both. Um, Conspiracy theories all kind of work together to get the same answer. I find that, there are forces working against us, and it kind of just the characters change to fit the narrative. So it could be migrants, it could be, Jewish people, Black people in some of these cases. Um, I think the overlap is so big, it's hard to separate the two. I think it's a bit of both.
Thank you. Niam's question: do you see the same level of mis and disinformation in response to natural disasters in other countries, particularly non-Western? Or is there something specific about the US?
Yeah, that's interesting because I was aware that I'd chosen three examples in America, and I thought, oh, what does this say? But I mean, again, I work primarily in English, so it's something that I've seen a lot. But also, at Resolver, we cover all regions and all languages, and it has been seen elsewhere. I just think, I mean, we're seeing a lot in the UK, for example, and it does feel kind of copied from the US, this kind of distrust against the government. Whereas I think other countries, some countries culturally have an inherent trust in authority and kind of governing bodies, whereas the US and the UK, we seem to be that's degrading a bit. So I think culture comes into it a lot as well. Um, so yeah, I would say the US and the UK are, and to be honest, a lot of Western Europe are becoming quite similar in that regard.
Thank you. Have you identified specific groups that fund or benefit from online climate misinformation or disinformation?
There are definitely, a lot of the climate denial groups, like I think it's the Heartland Institute, they have been found to have links with oil companies in the past. So, I think you've got to think about who benefits from climate change being a waste of time. And often it's the people selling the thing that causes climate change. So I think it's kind of like following the trail back. But in terms of specific groups, not necessarily, but I think you would have to, yeah, follow the trail back with climate change denial groups, see who pulls the strings.
What's the impact of new generative AI technologies and AI in general on the climate misinformation space? Have you seen any example of this?
Um, Not actually. I mean, not necessarily in climate mystics. I will say I did see like AI generated images during the wildfires. I think we all saw the famous image of the Hollywood sign on fire that was spelt with like three O or four O's or something. But I didn't see any AI that was convincing, that I think, most people couldn't mark out as being false. I don't know whether that quality in Gen AI is maybe just a little bit still to come. But so far, I think, the quality wasn't there. I personally didn't see anything that I think would look realistic. Yeah.
Okay. The next question is: what do you think should be the main priorities for media literacy education of young people to counter climate disinformation?
Yeah, I mean, I was relieved to see that, media literacy was a big part of the legislation because there's no better way of cutting the problem at the source if we all, take a second look. Um, I think it's been found that like a lot of the banners underneath mis and disinformation, a lot of people don't click on those to find out more information. So I wonder if it's a case of kind of before you press post, some sort of second, a chance to reflect on what you're about to post, maybe to, delay the thought process, to make people think a little bit harder before posting. Um, but yeah, I think media literacy in general should be I think during teen years um and on platforms that are the small but risky platforms, maybe not just the mainstream ones, should be considered in that as well.
Yeah, that's certainly. We have another question. Could you perhaps talk to how you expect some of the interventions you mentioned for platforms to perhaps consider how specific this? I really don't understand this question. Could you perhaps talk what to expect of the interventions you mentioned for platforms to perhaps consider how specific would be this to climate?
Well, the DSA, mentioned the environment, but also in a long list. It wasn't necessary. I mean, they did also cover some of the grey areas that I mentioned, the different flavors of climate change missed this. But for example, the OSA is a lot less specific in that regard. I think the difficulty is intent plays a massive part in both. And I think that's just going to be really challenging to implement because it's just really difficult to prove a poster's intention. So I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's specific to climate. It's probably, as I said, there's so many overlaps with all the different verticals that making it too specific might hinder progress.
Mm. Yeah, this is in line your answer to this other question on how we can make the fight against misinformation a priority in climate policies. What would it be your approach if talking to a policymakers?
Oh, I wish I knew. I mean, as I said in the last slide, the the only thing we can do, working with governments and regulators and platforms is continue to flag and to make clear that if left unchecked, this is where it can end up. It can, spiral into, a man turning up outside a storm relief site with weapons, having made, threats because he believes he's not getting the money he deserves during a climate change disaster. Um, I think maybe making that link is probably key to that it can affect real life. It's not just some in 50 years hypothetical. It's going to cause violence and health mistis and all the other things that were mentioned.
Okay, we have a few questions that would take us to the case studies, but let's finish with another one related to policy. How can mayors, city governments challenge climate disinformation? And how can European mayors use the DSA to fight back against climate disinformation?
Um, that's a difficult one. I think I mean, I don't mean to be repetitive, but the media literacy really does come into this. If it's something that's like provided by a city government or a mayor or, promoted, then that would be by far the best. In terms of how to use the DSA, just ensuring compliance with the DSA. It's a long process to stay compliant by the looks of things. I mean, we're a signatory of the Code of Conduct of Disinformation. It takes time, effort, diligence, but it's all part of the transparency, so we're all on the same page.
I guess this also answers another question that it's popping up here. Does just flagging the disinformation works best?
How does this just well, this is part of the, the consideration if, right now we're flagging by a by content approach. And, I was thinking if we review by behavior, would that work better? Because, flagging disinformation each time you come across it, it doesn't actually get to the root cause of the issue, that the person posting potentially believes this and will continue because they feel silenced. So, you know, maybe looking at the behavior in like a wider lens of, you know, maybe, as I said before, posting, they receive a message of, you know, science has proven this to be wrong. You know, would you like to review? Would you like to continue with this post? Because, you know, in order to use that platform, if that was a requirement, then I think the behavior would change. So, but again, that would take an exceedingly long time. So, you know, I understand the balance.
Some of the audience is interested in your investigation. There's this question about what's the scale involved for any of the cases. How many accounts are actively spreading misinformation, and how many are rebroadcasting?
That's difficult for me to answer, just because a lot of these investigations were OSINT and were you know, perhaps not, they were just using, you know, a lot of research. And, you know, many platforms have barriers in the way to collecting data, as many people know. So the scale, it would be anecdotal, any evidence I give here. It would be millions, I imagine, for accounts actively spreading disinformation. In terms of broadcasting, I think it's quite common with disinformation that, and we see it with information operations, that the message is spread by one large player and it is then disseminated by further smaller players, and it has a trickle down like that. It's, you know, something we see in foreign information operations. But it's so difficult to say.
Yeah, we have a question here that maybe we can answer together, because I'm not sure about the intent. Why people believe conspiracy theories rather than the actual documented conspiracies happening? What do you think?
I mean, I think, you know, because obviously I have a particular interest, a personal interest in climate mystics, and I would be over the moon if I found out climate change was a lie. It would be a great relief to me. It's a much easier problem to solve if you believe it's a government conspiracy theory. You know, it's just so much easier than we need to globally gather and agree. It's kind of just the easier option, in my opinion. It's scary to think about, and if you could answer it away with, well, it's actually not even real, I, you know, if I wasn't so in the know, I would love to believe that, but I just, yeah.
Yeah, I guess that when people don't understand something, it's easier for them to deny it. Anyway,
Yeah.
we are reaching more or less the end, so we have two more questions. Could you compare the level of disinformation on the mainstream media, politics, and the social media narrative? What could be the effect size of bots?
Um, so the disinformation on mainstream versus fringe, I think I'll take that to mean that question. I mean, obviously people go to like alt tech and fringe platforms because they, you know, find that the more mainstream platforms are censoring them, probably sometimes for good reason. And I think, yeah, this is the problem we've got. They're not popular enough to be under legislation, but they're popular enough that that's where a lot of dangerous narratives start. The effect of bots, this often comes a lot into play with like foreign interference, in my experience. And I didn't come across anything that I would say was indicative of like hostile state. This felt a very domestic risk. But you know, as governments start to implement, you know, widespread rules that mean we do without, so we can delay climate change, I imagine that would become more popular in time.
Last question. How would you say Resolver could help respond to the change in this information environment around the online climate discussion?
Well, I mean, the line between freedom of expression and, policy violation or illegal content, that's where we live in Resolver, and we really aim to identify problems before they become crises, and help our clients understand risks on their platform and advise policy development, to take account of the ever-changing landscape. And I think it's important to flag risks that are on the horizon. They may not be hitting that platform particularly hard at that time, but it's so transient, or transfers, I think is the word I'm looking for, across platforms, that we aim to be a horizon scan of risk, an in-depth look at risk, but while maintaining freedom of expression as well.
Thank you. We have a comment from Chequeado, fact-checking from Argentina. They say that they analyze narratives in Latin America about the dana in Spain and found similar claims. I guess this is happening, that they replicate in countries, right?
Yeah, I'm not surprised, sadly.
Okay, so this was the last question. We are running out of time. How fast this session has flown by, Jodie. We covered so much, and it's been truly a privilege to gain this deeper insight into climate disinformation. Before we close, I'd like to share two important announcements. Next week, on Thursday, 27th, we will be hosting a webinar on countering gender and identity disinformation with Kate Sanner from Sync Network. Then following week, on the 6th of March, another webinar, Melodies of Malice. This is super interesting. It will help us to understand how AI fuels the creation and spread of extremist music, with Heron Lopez from Leiden University Institute of Political Science. And again, for our EU DisinfoLab annual conference in October, remember that you have until tomorrow to submit your proposals. So if you have an investigation on this information or something to talk about it, let us know. Our webinar today is coming to an end, and you will be prompted to complete a brief survey where you can not only provide feedback, but also suggest future topics. We are all ears. Thank you again to our great speaker, Jodie Molyneux from Resolver, and to everyone who joined us today. Wishing you all a wonderful rest of the day, and we look forward to see you again. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.